Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into the Federalist Files. I'll be covering Federalist number 36 today. It is titled The Same Subject Continued Concerning the General Power of Taxation, written by Alexander Hamilton, January 8th, 1788. Topics include land tax, assessors will be elected or appointed, double taxation ought not to exist, small state land tax, once debts are paid, will suffice. So this one's going to actually be. This will conclude the subject of the general power of taxation, and then from here on out, I think we're going to be going to the type of government that should be proposed is like the next subsection. Yeah, the government that's going to be proposed, that'll go from Federalist Paper number 37 to 51. 51's a big one. And then from there, I think we're going to start to see the three branches. We're going to go through the House of Reps and then the Senate and then the executive. And then I think it concludes with the judiciary. And then two papers, 84 and 85, just kind of clear up any misconceptions and ideas that he did not get out during the papers, Hamilton and Madison and John Jay. So to start this one off, Hamilton repeats what he stated in the last paper. He states, and I quote, "Whether the representation of the people be more or less numerous, it will consist almost entirely of proprietors of land, of merchants, and of members of learned professions who will truly represent all those different interests and views," end quote. So once again, he's just going over the last paper where he's talking about the merchant class mostly will be the composition of the government or the House of Representatives, the people that are supposed to directly represent you. It's mostly going to be people of the merchant class. They're also going to be people that own land, members of learned professions. Essentially, he's trying to say, in this one, he's trying to clear up, because his last paper, he was saying the merchant class is going to mostly comprise our government. He's trying to clear up that really it is open to anyone. And he says, and then he goes on, he goes, "There are exceptions to this rule." And I quote, "If it should be objected that we have seen other descriptions of men in the local legislatures, I answer that it is admitted that there are exceptions to the rule, but not in sufficient number to influence the general complexion or character of the government. There are strong minds in every walk of life that will rise superior to the disadvantages of situation and will command the tribute due to their merit, not only from the classes to which they particularly belong, but from the society in general," end quote. So he's saying, okay, most of these people are going to be landowners, they're going to be merchants, they're going to have some sort of learned profession. Essentially, he's trying to say people in the government are going to be somewhat professional, and they're not just going to be some bum that comes out of nowhere, right? And then he says, but there's always exceptions to the rule. Maybe they don't hold one of these professions, and maybe they're not a merchant and they're not a landowner like an AOC type character. That maybe they can be some sort of a person that is an exception to the rule, because that is possible to have anomalies. But he's trying to say mostly the composition will be people that are, I guess you would call them maybe a little bit more successful in life, I guess, and merchants. But Hamilton believes that the majority of representation will consist of those classes of citizen. He goes on, he states, and I quote, "It is notorious that there are often as great rivalships between different branches of the mechanic or manufacturing arts as there are between any of the departments of labor and industry, so that unless the representative body were to be far more numerous than would be consistent with any idea of regularity or wisdom in its deliberations, it is impossible that what seems to be the spirit of the objection we have been considering should ever be realized in practice," end quote. So I don't really know exactly what he's saying here. He's saying the great rivalships between the different branches of the mechanic, or the what he's saying is that's the point. That's why we're not going to have people that are mechanics or manufacturing arts. We're going to moreover have just generally the merchant class, because they're more representative of the whole, or the whole, because they don't have their own personal bias. Essentially, that's what he's trying to say. Yeah. And then next, Hamilton confronts the objection that the concurrent powers of taxation will interfere with one another. He states that state governments will have the knowledge to know what taxes would best accommodate their citizens, and they would work in coordination with the federal officials to ensure that they do not tax the same items. And this has been a giant point of contention. He's gone over this multiple times. He states, and I quote, "It has been asserted that a power of internal taxation in the national legislature could never be exercised with advantage, as well from the want of a sufficient knowledge of local circumstances as from an interference between the revenue laws of the Union and of the particular states." End quote. He's talking about internal taxation. He's saying if there was an internal taxation that was somehow employed by the federal government, it would never be effectively done and exercised to their advantage because you are unaware of the composition of that particular state. So if it's New Jersey, for example, let's say we are very voluminous with crops, and that is our main point of commercial value is, let's say, mostly tomatoes, blueberries, things of that nature. The federal government would not be good at coming in and then figuring out how the taxing is to be done in this state. They want to leave it up to the state governments, local governments to figure it out, which makes more sense. And that's what's kind of weird in our politics now. Currently, everything revolves around the big federal head. It all revolves around D.C. because that's really what sells most of the time, and that's why the president is always that figurehead. So whenever there's any type of issue, everyone just points to the president, whoever the president is at that time, and usually it's them that are at fault. Meanwhile, there's another two branches in the government that could be screwing it up, and one in particularly is most of the time screwing it up, which is the legislative branch. Now, the way that politics currently works is the executive, it seems like, kind of is a figurehead and also does push certain policy. They are almost like the leader of the party. So if you have a Republican president, they may say, hey, this is what we want to get done to the legislative branch, and the legislative branch goes through with the process of trying to write up law to get that done. That's kind of what it seems like now. Years ago, it wasn't like that. It was much more decentralized, where there wasn't a lot of moves trying to be made by the government. So when I refer in my own videos, usually I'll refer, hey, the Biden administration wants to do this, or the Democrat Party wants to do this. I try to not generalize. I try to say if it literally is coming from the horse's mouth, the Democrat Party wants to do this. This is the legislation that they're putting forth, or the Biden press secretary is saying this in particular. And that's kind of the difference, is what he's trying to get at here is that the federal government is not good at doing local jurisdiction work. We should not have the federal government, for example, coming down to Nashville, Tennessee, and telling Nashville how to tax. It doesn't make any sense. They're not from the area. They don't understand the commercial value of what's going on and the way that goods are moving throughout the economy over in Nashville, Tennessee, that the federal head should be regulating it over there. Yeah, it's the same. It's generally the same theme here. He's just saying the internal taxation, the national legislature could never exercise it with the advantage. So next, Hamilton assesses the representatives of the House will be of and from the people and will have a intertwined knowledge of state affairs accommodating to their constituency, which makes sense because of what he just said beforehand, saying that the national legislature can never exercise the power of internal taxation at advantage. And when he says internal taxation, he means some sort of, let's say, a sales tax within the state, or state highway tax, or whatever, the million taxes that we have in the state. Certain items or commodities are taxed at different rates. For example, in New Jersey, if you want to go buy clothes, a shirt, or something of that nature, it is 0% tax rate, whereas food is taxed, I think, if it's prepared food, it's taxed at 6.625. If it's food that is not prepared, if you go to get a box of cereal that's not considered a prepared food, that has no tax on it. And then it depends also, they have all these areas, certain areas that have low income also, or I think the tax rate there is only 3.5%. It's like cut in half for whatever reason, to try to spur the economy in those areas, in those low income areas. So Hamilton differentiates between direct and indirect taxes, which I just kind of went on. And Hamilton goes on to address land tax. He calls for a system of state officials that have knowledge on the local level that will be elected or appointed to assess the land tax. And I went on, I said what the direct tax was. Now the indirect tax is the import and export tax, essentially, and that was supposed to be of the federal government power. Most of the federal government's taxation power is supposed to be of indirect taxation, but he will go on to explain how the federal government also needs to have the ability to do a direct tax, to have the power to do it if it's needed, but not have that as the main focus of taxation, or really carry the brunt of taxation. Really, that was supposed to be the lifeblood, or rather the bedrock of the taxation coming from the federal government, should mostly be of the indirect taxation on imports and exports, and if they really need it in a dire circumstance, they would go ahead with direct taxation. But at the end of the day, you don't want to tax too much, and he goes over that here. He states, and I quote, "The objection, when applied to real property or to houses and lands, appears to have, at first sight, more foundation, but even in this view, it will not bear a close examination. Land taxes are commonly laid in one of two modes, either by actual valuations, permanent or periodical, or by occasional assessments, at the discretion or according to the best judgment of certain officers whose duty it is to make them," end quote. So he's talking about land tax, real property taxes, which at this time was probably very difficult to evaluate and assess. I think even nowadays it is. Now, during COVID, people will literally assess, if you go to get a loan from a bank, they'll assess your house from the curb. They'll stand in New Jersey, at least they will, because I have friends that have done this, that have had someone come to assess their house for a loan, and they'll stand at the curb and they'll say, the assessor will sit there with a clipboard and go, "Oh, it looks like it's worth $365,000," and they'll just write it down. That's it. They don't even walk in the house at this point. So just to assess land at that time was probably actually a very difficult job. In New Jersey, the tax rate is outrageous, the property tax. So I don't even know how they figure it out now, but it's absolutely, if you're living in the middle of New Jersey and you're not living on the border between Philly and Trenton, you are paying exorbitant tax rates pretty much no matter where you are. A little bit, if you go to South Jersey, it's a little bit cheaper, but other than that, it's expensive throughout New Jersey, other than South and then right next to Philly. So here he's explaining, you need people from the area that are going to be the land assessors. You cannot have the direct taxation of a property tax laid by the federal government. You can't have federal government personnel come out to New Jersey, which they've never been to, and tell people how much their land is assessed at and how much property tax they should be paying every single year. Which makes sense. And it's also a very quick path to oppression, tax oppression, because they can go and they can appraise all these areas in New Jersey for a lot, and then in New York they can appraise for low, depending on who you know. I mean, that's the way the government works in general. There's a lot of connected people. If you've noticed, there's a lot of, at least in my state, I'm not sure where it's going on everywhere else, but in my state, and I've heard stories about New York as well, we have New York teachers right now going, and because they're in a union, they're getting the shot first, the COVID-19 vaccination first, while older people are waiting outside, and then they're not even able to get the vaccine, and then these young teachers are going home and they're teaching from home. So they're getting the vaccination, and they're cowards for this. They're getting the vaccination because they're in the union. They're not at risk. They're not an at-risk group. It's just because they are in the union. That's the way politics works. That's the way power works. That's the way the influence of the union works, because they have politicians guaranteed, hey, we're all going to vote for you. We're going to push you in this next election. And there's a lot of people doing that in New Jersey. They're having smokers get first dibs. And that's something that's kind of, to me, that's weird, because that's something that you choose to do. You choose to be a smoker. And then also, from what I understand, federal employees right now are getting first dibs too, above older people that are actually more at risk than the federal employee is. So that's the way the politics works, and that's because a lot of these federal employees, once again, they're unionized. And it just shows that there's a lot of people out there that are cowards and they have no dignity. That's all it is, really. Now, once again, you want people from the area to be able to tax for land, to be able to evaluate the property. Now, next he goes on, he states, and I quote, "The execution of the business, which alone requires the knowledge of local details, must be devolved upon discrete persons in the character of commissioners or assessors elected by the people or appointed by the government for the purpose, end quote. So here he's saying these people that are assessing the land and also assessing businesses are to be either elected or appointed by government, and appointed meaning they are appointed by someone that is elected. Essentially, they're a government bureaucrat. Hamilton continues that the federal government will use the tax structure of each state to collect federal taxes. And this is kind of where you get to the murky area where there's a little bit of contention. He states, and I quote, "The method of laying and collecting this species of taxes in each state can in all its parts be adopted and employed by the federal government," end quote. This is the part that's kind of, there's a lot of objection to this because they're worried about an oppressive tax rate and the federal government taking too much tax away from and power away from the state governments. And he continues on this. He states, and I quote, "Let it be recollected that the proportion of these taxes is not to be left to the discretion of the national legislature, but is to be determined by the numbers of each state, as described in the second section of the first article. An actual census or enumeration of the people must furnish the rule, a circumstance which effectually shuts the door to partiality or oppression," end quote. So this is what is very interesting. He's talking about, based on the population, this is how these taxes are going to be collected. But it's not to be left up to the national legislature. So pretty much the state government's gonna look at how many people they have, and then they're gonna figure out how much they need based on their population size. What's interesting about this is this kind of almost sounds like a poll tax. Poll tax meaning just for your existence, for being part of the population, you have to pay a certain amount of money. That's what it kind of sounds like. And then at the very end here, he goes on to actually explain how he's not in favor of a poll tax, but he does not want to take any taxation off the table just because he was so worried about self-preservation and the common defense that he thinks that all avenues of taxation should be available. So as it pertains to internal revenue of the federal government, the approval of people will be needed in order to mandate each rule of taxation, which will be checked to ensure the power will not be exploited. And that's really the safeguard on this. So he's saying the national legislature should not be left up to the proportion of the taxes, should not be in individual states. Like, okay, so New York, you guys are going to have to pay 70% of your GDP in taxes, or New Jersey, you guys only have to pay 30% of your GDP in taxes. He says it's not going to work that way. The taxes that are going to be sent up the ladder to the federal government are going to be by the amount of people that are the census, meaning the population of the people that live in that particular state. That's how much taxation they're due to that. It sounds, like I said again, it sounds like a poll tax, and then they send the money up the board or up the chain of command up to the federal government. That's what it sounds like to me. And that's why, like I said, he's very ominous in the way in which he explains it. It's a little confusing at points because you don't really exactly know what he's getting at. I think he's trying to say that he just wants to leave every single avenue of taxation on the table just in case of exigency circumstances. So Hamilton states next, and I quote, if the exercise of the power of internal taxation by the Union should be discovered on experiment to be really inconvenient, the federal government may then forbear the use of it and have recourse to requisitions in its stead," end quote. So he's saying, yeah, we're going to try to work this out. We're going to have some sort of taxation. Let's say it's consumption taxes and it's sales tax, and then a certain percentage based on whatever your population is goes to the federal government. And this is found to be ineffective and inconvenient. We're going to get rid of it. So next, Hamilton confronts double sets of tax officers, meaning if we're going to have a federal government tax and we're also going to have a state government taxes, there are going to be two sets of tax officers to come and collect taxation from us. So he answers this question. He states, and I quote, "As to the first point, there are two cases in which there can be no room for double sets of officers. One where the right of imposing the tax is exclusively vested in the Union, which applies to the duties on imports. The other where the object has not fallen under any state regulation or provision, which may be applicable to a variety of objects. In other cases, the probability is that the United States will either wholly abstain from the objects preoccupied for local purposes, or will make use of the state officers and state regulations for collecting the additional imposition," end quote. So he's saying at the end of the day, there will never be a double set of tax officers, just because that is a complete waste of money. But the federal government will use, if needed, they will use the apparatus of the state government collection services to also get a piece of their cut. And he explained this, I think, he explains this in one of these papers. He did it before, where he said the amount on imports and exports is to go to the government of tariffs of taxation to the federal government, with the exception of how much it costs for individual states to run the tax officials. So the tax officials would be paid. Essentially, the state would hold on to a little bit of that revenue that's coming in through taxation to pay their tax officers, the people that are collecting it, but then the rest would go to the federal government. So really, technically, these state officials really are employed by the federal government, technically, because the revenue that's being collected by the federal government is being kicked back down to these tax officers to pay them. They explain this. And he says there's certain things that are exclusively taxed by the state, and they're of the local character. That variety of objects we are not going to mess with. We'll just leave the state be, let them do what they have to do. So a lot of this taxation, in terms of double taxation, the state as well as the federal government getting a piece, it sounds very. He's very broad with it, and that's the point of the Constitution to begin with. It is very broad, in very broad terms, to kind of leave openings to manipulate the rules or change the laws around if it's needed. So you don't need an amendment every single time a law needs to be changed. But at the same time, the substantial, very important laws need to actually be changed by an amendment to the Constitution. So from what it sounds like here is that they're going to use their discretion to make sure there's not a double tax on objects, but there's no guarantee that there's not going to be a double tax on objects. Now, in the Constitution itself, it laid out that there was not supposed to be a taxation on income, which they changed through the 16th Amendment. And that was another thing. If we're worried about double taxation, our income tax is double tax. It's actually more than double tax, because we have the state government getting a piece, federal government gets a piece, and then we have Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security also as well that you pay into. And then there's some, depending on what state you live in, there's certain social safety net programs as well that you pay through your paycheck. So we're getting taxed into oblivion now compared to what they were getting taxed at this time. It was maybe 3%. It was a very small percentage. Now, Hamilton believed that it was important for the state's taxation system to be used rather than the federal government taxing citizens directly because, and this is very important, and I quote, when the states know that the union can apply itself without their agency, it will be a powerful motive for exertion on their part, end quote. Meaning that if the federal government has their own employed tax officers that have some sort of infinite, because they are federal tax officers, they have some infinite authority to an extent that will cause the state to act up against the federal government. So you're better off just having, the state, we reserve that power to the state, and the state kicks it up to the federal government. As long as the federal government is providing and doing what they're supposed to do as the union, they're protecting individual states and they're providing them with what is their job. It's kind of like it's almost like a business transaction. Well, the federal government, we will protect you in New Jersey. New Jersey, you give us whatever taxations we need to run our government to protect you and also protect all the other states that are in the union. It does really make sense, and it also works as a safeguard as well, because if the federal government ever becomes tyrannical, the states can just say, okay, well, we're not going to give you anything that we get through exports or imports. Good luck. Have fun with that. So next, Hamilton addresses the issue of avoiding double taxation. He states, and I quote, an effectual expedient for the purpose will be mutually to abstain from those objects which either side may have first had recourse to, end quote. So once again, it's just the idea of the discretion to do it. There is no specific prohibition, from what it seems like, of a double taxation. They will just try to use their discretion and work the system so there's not an over taxation on a certain product, so there's no tax oppression going on. He continues that this is only temporary, actually, here. He states, and I quote, when the particular debts of the states are done away and their expenses come to be limited within their natural compass, the possibility almost of interference will vanish. A small land tax will answer the purpose of the states and will be their most simple and most fit resource, end quote. So we are so far away from that principle that he says. So essentially, the taxation at this point was supposed to be high in the states because the states had to pay back for the war, and they had to pay it up the chain to the federal government to pay back for all of the debt that had been incurred over the Revolution. the Revolutionary War. He said once that's done, it's just going to be a small land tax or a small property tax. That will be the answer to most of the purposes of the state, the civil list of the state, to allow them to carry out their obligation and their duty. And that'll be it. It'll be small. It won't be. So now we pay state income, we pay sales tax, and we pay exorbitant rates on property tax in New Jersey. We're just so far away from what we originally were supposed to be doing. So Hamilton concludes by answering the fears of objectors to double taxation. He states, and I quote, "The wants of the Union are to be supplied in one way or another. If to be done by the authority of the federal government, it will not be done by that of the state government. If it to be done by the authority of the federal government, it will not be done by that of the state government," end quote. I don't exactly know what he's trying to get at here, but what he's essentially getting at is the preservation of the Union, the self-preservation is paramount among everything. And he's said that. I've said this many times. He says it many times throughout the papers. And they need to be supplied. It is dire circumstances. It's an existential thing. If the federal government is unable to fund themselves and fund a military, then there is no longer the United States of America. Thus, the Union will be supplied in one way or the other. And I think what he's trying to say is either the federal government authority of taxation or the state government taxation authority, we're going to be able to fund the federal government. That is paramount above everything, just for self-preservation reasons. I don't know why I said, he concludes that. Okay, so next he states, and I quote, "The quantity of taxes to be paid by the community must be the same in either case, with this advantage. If the provision is to be made by the Union that the capital resource of commercial imposts, which is the most convenient branch of revenue, can be prudently improved to much greater extent under federal than under state regulation, and of course will render it less necessary to recur to more inconvenient methods," end quote. So he's saying really the main source of revenue for the federal government should be imports and exports, and because this is the most convenient branch of revenue for the federal government, and it can be prudently or carefully improved to a much greater extent to have a wide array and have a wider scope to extend under federal than under state regulation. And of course this will render it less necessary to use other methods of taxation that may infringe on state governments to tax. And he continues, and I quote, "And with this further advantage that as far as there may be any real difficulty in the exercise of the power of internal taxation, it will impose a disposition to greater care in the choice and arrangement of the means, and must naturally tend to make it a fixed point of policy in the national administration to go as far as may be practicable in making the luxury of the rich tributary to the public treasury in order to diminish the necessity of those impositions which might create dissatisfaction in the poorer and most numerous classes of the society. Happy it is when the interest which the government has in the preservation of its own power coincides with a proper distribution of the public burdens and tends to guard the least wealthy part of the community from oppression." End quote. So essentially what he's talking about actually is he's talking about a fair tax across the board that is equal in terms of the percentage, so that it's not tyrannical or oppressive for people of the lower class, the least wealthy part of the community. It doesn't become oppressive to them, and it should not be built up so it only benefits the rich part of the community. A luxury, making the luxury of rich tributary to the public treasury in order to diminish the necessity of those impositions which might create dissatisfaction in the poorer and most numerous classes of the society. Yeah, so he's saying that there should be a fixed, and he states, and must naturally tend to make it a fixed point of policy. So he's talking about just a fixed taxation rate from what it sounds like, which is nothing like what's going on today. what's going on today is we have a progressive tax rate. The more you make, the more you pay, and the less you make, the less you pay. And it's not well, obviously, if you made more and the tax rate was the same, then obviously you would pay more. But I'm talking about the percentage that you pay. The more you make, the percentage you pay is higher than if the less you make, the percentage you pay is lower. There's some people that when they go to file their taxes, they actually get a refund from the government. And then there's some people when they go to file their taxes, they actually have to pay more to the government when they've already paid so much already. So to me, it's not really a fair system. I think that it should just be a straight across the board percentage point, because then everyone would feel, they would all kind of be on the same page. I think that would actually create some sort of sense of unity if everyone just paid the exact same percentage. If we didn't have, because then this is the way it works. If we have politicians that come in and they say, oh, we're going to tax cut for this class of citizen, or we're going to do a tax cut for this class, the lower class or the upper class, then people are going to vote among party lines just based on what individually benefits them. And if you're of the richer class, you would think that they would vote for whatever keeps more money in their pocket. But I mean, the way that it works now currently is it's not a fair system to the people that are on top. People on top are paying more than half of their income. Every single half. Imagine going to work for a 10-hour shift, and 5 of the hours that you're working, you're not working for yourself. You're working for the government to hand them a check at the end of the day. So that's what's going on right now. That is the oppressive tax rate is on the upper class or the upper middle class. They're getting oppressively taxed at a much higher percentage than the lower class. Lower class, depending on how much you make, sometimes you don't even pay federal tax. You get everything just handed right back to you in a refund check. And like I said, I think it's the fairest system to just have a straight flat tax, because then people aren't voting on which candidate better benefits my tax bracket rather than benefiting everybody. Because everybody, if we could get together and say, hey, there's one tax, and this politician saying, hey, look, I'm looking to lower the tax for everybody across the board by 3%. I think that would be more of a fair and just system. Hamilton in this excerpt answers that there will be no double taxation and that there will be no double sets of revenue officers, which I don't know where I got that from. I must be a typo. The double taxation of the tax officers is correct, but the double taxation, he doesn't say there's a straight prohibition, but they're going to try their best not to mess around with it. Hamilton continues with the dislike of poll taxes in terms of the federal government, but if the states need to use it in order to provide revenues, he isn't opposed to that. So he goes on to state, and I quote, as to poll taxes, I, without scruple, confess by disapprobation of them, as in dissatisfaction of them. And though they have prevailed from an early period in those states which have uniformly been the most tenacious of their rights, I should lament to see them introduced into practice under the national government, end quote. So he's actually saying it's been used uniformly in individual states, but he laments at the idea of them even being introduced into the national government, so he does not want to see them in the national government. Hamilton exudes his general principles of taxation. He states, and I quote, as little friendly as I am to the species of imposition, I still feel a thorough conviction that the power of having recourse to it ought to exist in the federal government, end quote. So what he's essentially saying is he goes, listen, I'm not friendly to tax. I don't like tax. We fought a war over tax. But I still think that we need to have some sort of recourse in the federal government in case of the exigency circumstance that we need to be able to tax. So the reason behind the philosophy, as has been mentioned before, is the necessity to handle possible emergencies and provide for the common defense. So he goes on, and this is probably the largest quote I've had here. He states, and I quote, there are certain emergencies of nations in which expedients that in the ordinary state of things ought to be forborne become essential to the public weals and the public welfare, and the government from the possibility of such emergencies ought ever to have the option of making use of them. The real scarcity of objects in this country, which may be considered as productive sources of revenue, is a reason peculiar to itself for not abridging the discretion of the national councils in this respect. There may exist certain critical and tempestuous conjunctures of the state in which a poll tax may become become an inestimable resource. And as I know nothing to exempt this portion of the globe from the common calamities that have befallen other parts of it, I acknowledge my aversion to every project that is calculated to disarm the government of a single weapon which in any possible contingency might be usefully employed for the general defense and security, end quote. And the reason I left such a long, ornate statement in there is most importantly, I don't want to take anything that I do in these papers. I don't want to do it any injustice. I want to be as justified and reasonable and principled, and I don't want to really throw my own political leanings in there, even though most of my political leanings really come from this as well as the Constitution to begin with, and that's why I didn't want to take it out of context. So most importantly, and he goes on to say, hey, I think that poll tax, if the states, if they want to employ that, I'm not a huge fan of it. I think actually in the Constitution there's a prohibition against poll tax. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure there may be. I think there is. I want to say there isn't a prohibition of poll tax, but I'm not sure. He goes, the states, if they want to do it, and then he goes, with the federal government, he goes, I don't want to take anything off the table. I think that we need to recognize and we need to plan for every single avenue of possible taxation for the federal government just because of our general, and at the very end, this is why I have the entire statement on here, employed for the general defense and security. Okay, so that's the contingency circumstance that he's stating. So what is going on right now in our system, in our federal government, and this is why I wanted to apply this to today, we are getting taxed at confiscatory rates. And 2/3 of our taxes, 2/3 of our budget every single year are going to social safety net programs, going to Social Security, going to Medicare, Medicaid, okay? That has nothing to do with the general defense and security of a nation. So we are getting taxed at the end of a gun by our federal government right now to pay for social safety net systems. We're not paying for the military with this extreme amount of taxation. Okay, so that's why when I get, everyone's always complaining, oh, military spending's too much. How about we worry about the social safety net? Because that makes 2/3 of our pay of the federal government's budget every single year. That's where all of our money's going to. It's a funnel. It's a broken system that needs to be reformed. If anything, at the very least, if not abolished, it needs to be reformed. Imagine if you were able to take home 2/3 of what you're getting taxed. If you're telling me, oh, I'm getting taxed this much, if I'm getting taxed $20,000 a year, imagine 2/3 gets dropped right off of $20,000. How much money you could save every single year? How much more money that is? That's what? It's around 16, maybe 16, 15,000, 14,000, maybe $15,000 that you are now saving. And every single year, and then that adds up over the years. If you think, okay, so I'm working for 20 years and I'm paying let's say it's the same every single year, I'm working 20 years, that comes out to $200,000 over those 20 years. That is the savings. That is your retirement fund. That's why I don't understand the idea of, and not only that's $200,000, that's without putting it in a 401k or throwing it in a stocks and bonds system or invest. That's with no investments, $200,000. Imagine if you invested that money, where what you would see, where it would go. And that's what I'm trying to get across here. For the working class, these social safety net systems, they do not work for you. You are getting screwed by the government. We are all getting screwed by the government in these social safety net systems that take up 2/3 of our budget every single year. I don't know why people are pointing to the military. The military we pay, I don't think we pay our military guys enough to begin with. And now military budget funding, yeah, it's high. And the reason it's high is probably because of all the high-tech stuff that we have in our military. But our guys in particular, especially in the VA, it is a screwed up system. They're not getting paid enough. I would be very willing to pay more. I'd be willing to have $1 trillion military budget every single year if you're telling me that our troops get paid a little better and then our VA system isn't even nearly as screwed up as before, and we don't have homeless veterans on the street. Instead of worrying about social safety net systems of people that don't want to work. But that's currently what's going on right now. And there's been just a malfeasance from and a negligence from our federal government Congress, our presidents, and this is also went on during the Trump administration. This was going on for 4 years. The spending was blown out those 4 years too. It's been the same now since Bush, where we're unable to balance the budget every single year. And he ends this paper here. He states, and I quote, "I have now gone through the examination of such of the powers proposed to be vested in the United States, which may be considered as having an immediate relation to the energy of the government, and have endeavored to answer the principal objections which have been made to them," end quote. So, essentially what he's saying here, he's saying, I've gone through everything, and most importantly, this taxation is going to give the United States government, as in the federal government, the energy to govern. And I've endeavored to answer the principal objections which have been made of the taxation and the energy of the government. And then I think at the very end he writes something like, and now we're going to go on to this, the government that's supposed to be, I think it's the government that's proposed. Let me see what our next topic is going to be. The Republican form of the proposed Constitution. So I guess we're going to get more into the branches and the organizational structure. It's going to get more interesting as we go on, because I think Madison writes a lot of these going forward. It's going to be less repetitious. So that's going to be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Make sure you check out the I'm recording this beforehand, but the weekend special. I greatly appreciate it. Drop the mic, let people know about the podcast. If you want, you could send me any emails, maybe articles, things you want me to talk about in any of these current event episodes. I would greatly appreciate it. And I will see you all this weekend. Thank you.